Hello and welcome to a very special edition of 5 Questions in 5 Minutes, where we may not stick to 5 questions or 5 minutes. And not only that, we've already talked to Stephen for 5 Questions in 5 minutes, but I want to bring him back, and he's kindly agreed to talk about a book I've just finished reading that he wrote about Terence Conran. And I found this book astonishingly humorously, intelligently witty. Just it has so much depth, and I just couldn't resist coming back to you, Stephen, if I may, and ask you some. And in a way, I don't really mind where this conversation goes, but because I could honestly talk for hours about this. I feel like you've given me the not the sort of sound, almost the kind of intellectual soundtrack to my life. You've explained so much about what happened. So let me kick off with this question. I know you've covered Terence's life both in this book and also, or if not him, somebody very like him in a fictional book. And I wondered, in the process of writing the facts down, and I'll come on to this book in a second, but just in terms of the process of writing the factual book and the fictional book about essentially the same man, is one more satisfying than the other?
Well, we really need the lawyers present to give an accurate answer to that. I actually think it's an accident it happened like this. I'd always wanted to write a memoir of Terence, who was he was lots of things, but he was certainly the least boring person I've ever met. I mean, no one, people have called him all sorts of things, but no one's ever said Terence Conran, what a boring man. So the memoir, I wanted to sort of describe the life I'd lived sort of through Terence. He made a lot of wonderful things possible for a lot of people. He made a lot of very unpleasant things happen for a lot of people as well. But it's a great, great, great story. But you ask about the difference between the fictionalized version. It's a roman à clef I wrote about a character called Eustace Dunn, who's not exactly Terence, but as you say, is very closely modelled on him. And, I think the truth is, somebody once said all memoirs are novels and all novels are memoirs. And I think probably for me, I'm so flattered what you said about you like the factual memoir. I'm delighted. I think in a way the fictionalized one probably touches on a deeper truth.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Had there been no lawyers, would that still have been the case? Were you free to write whatever you wanted?
There would have been the real life memoir without the lawyers. The real life memoir would have been slightly more slightly more pointed. I'm afraid the fact is that libel law, it was written long before Terence died. It could only be published after he died because it's a terrible story, really. He knew I was writing the book, encouraged me to do so, sent him the manuscript and said, Terence did thing. And we were very close. And he said, if you don't like what I've written here, if I've got anything wrong, tell me and I'll correct it. If you said anything I strongly disagree with, tell me and we can discuss it, and we might make changes. Instead, I got a 6-page letter from a lawyer, and one of those letters which begins unless, and as somebody once said, one of the most terrifying words in the English language is unless. So it couldn't be published in his lifetime. And the worrying thing about that is that libel laws now make it effectively impossible to write anything less than a hagiographic account of a living person. You can't, because anybody, there are lots of aggressive lawyers around who will get you for something. So that's when the novel really, took off. In the novel, I had to make so many changes to that as well, because there's something called innuendo law, which if somebody claims they can be identified as a character who's represented in an unflattering term in the novel, again, you can end up in court, and no one wants to end up in court. In cases like this, it's sort of 6 figures before lunchtime.
Yeah.
So they're both. What ideally, if anybody's still interested in Terence, I sometimes wonder whether it fascinates me how someone who dominated so many of our lives for such a long time, how someone's very rapidly gone into a sort of obscurity. He's sort of unknown to anybody under about 50. But really, the 2 books should be read side by side. The fiction.
Yeah.
It all makes that.
But it's interesting because that's one of the reasons I found the book so profound, is because you remind me, and I presume us, how important he was in so many ways, and I mean that in a sort of psycho-geographical space that we call London. I cannot now go anywhere without thinking of something in your book.
Well, this is, thank you for saying that, but that's exactly my motivation. I mean, I think and this was Terence's genius, and I don't use the word carelessly. I mean, he was a genius at understanding the mood of the moment. A genius too for exploiting other people to help him realize it. But for 20, 30 years, perhaps even more, he was, if you were, sort of a liberal, educated bohemian who enjoyed food and things and that way, he represented. He represented he was saying, this is talk about marketing. He had this brilliant conception of how to sell himself. I don't think it was conscious. I think he just couldn't help doing it. He got himself in the color magazines, and remember, Habitat was launched in the same year as the Sunday Times color magazine, which was amazingly important in the 1960s. Terence got him features about him there. He said, "Look at me, look at me. I'm having what a gorgeous time I'm having. Lunch in the sunshine with my friends. If you go to my shops, you'll be able to live. You'll be able to live like me too." And it's sort of vaguely nonsensical, but it was also actually true. I love the best line ever anybody's had about Terence Conran was his old friend, the art dealer, John Casmin, who was David Hockney's, gallerist. Casmin once said, without trying to be funny, he really meant it. He said, "The problem with Terence is that he wants everybody to have a better salad bowl."
Yeah,
And I think that's wonderful. I mean, I'm not, Casmin was sort of, he didn't see the funny side. I see the funny side, but it's also true. What you'd never want to take away from Terence is that his love of things, whatever they were, this, whatever, it's absolutely genuine. In fact, I think one of the
Sorry, I couldn't quite see what you held up
it
there.
was just a little Japanese pot.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't matter what it is. It could be.
Would it be
It's anything. He could pick up something. He could pick up an apricot and sniff the cleft of an apricot and talk rhapsodically about a woman's bottom. His love of things was absolute, and it was infectious, and he passed it on.
But I think, if I may interrupt briefly, because I think what you do so beautifully, and I think you do this with generosity of spirit. I don't think this is in any sense a criticism. I think you and correct me if I'm wrong, but I come out of the book thinking this man is truly extraordinary. He is many, many things. He's not necessarily a great designer, but he sure as hell has the sort of foresight and talent to, as you say, bring people together and change lives and move us all forward in whether it's in retail or in restaurant. But within that, I wondered, it occurred to me, in the way you wrote it at least, that he somehow overlapped design, brand. He kind of creates his own brands along the way, including himself, arguably. Promotion, as you've just said, in the marketing, he must have delivered PR. And if that's all in his own character and his work,
but he did this. Your analysis is exactly right. I mean, Terence actually detested the word lifestyle.
Right.
Typical Terence, I say it's fondly affectation. He would speak instead of l'art de vivre, the art of living, which is why my novel is called the art of living. Because l'art de vivre, as the French say, that is lifestyle. And Terence saw it all as a whole, and he sold it very successfully. I mean, his great achievement. When he said he was not a great designer, he admitted that himself. What he did professionally was what a lot of successful people do. He hired the best people, then took credit for their work.
Yeah.
That's not unknown in cinema or politics or anywhere else. But he was very happy to be identified as a designer. But towards the end of his life, he couldn't even explain what it meant.
Yeah.
Because what he actually did, and this is for me the best line in the memoir, what he did. He actually monetized his own taste, or presented his own personal taste as a whole package of, you wear this, you drive this, you eat this, you sit on this, you go, and it was Terence's taste. It actually happened to be my taste. It was probably very close to your taste as well, and a lot of us. And he managed to monetize that through his shops, and he told us that all that was design. And it was in a way, but design is much more, it's lots of other things as well. But Terence just did this amazing thing about his life and his art, were all the same thing. And he packaged it with genius and persuaded us all that was the way to live. And I believe it. I still do.
And I think that's a beautifully succinct way to describe his brilliance, if you like. If I may go back and unravel it slightly, he does appear within that to have a real, genuine talent for promotion, marketing, PR, whatever you want to call it. And I guess there's a question I wondered, and this could be a question as to what you see or what Terence saw. It doesn't really matter. But I mean, the world has, in the commercial sense, divided all these things into very delineated spaces where I do PR, I do marketing, I do brand consultancy, whatever it is. And yet I imagine you and Terence were just sort of going along blurring those lines willy-nilly. But is the question, I think, if there is a question in here, is does it just require brilliant people to just do great things, or can you delineate these things and go and earn a living in PR slash brand slash?
Yeah, well, of course you can, but again, what fascinates about Terence is of course, he had a personal PR. I had several, and I knew most of them, but he actually paid very little on advertising, because there was, for him, it was, why pay for advertising when the Sunday Times would, do 4 double-page spreads about your latest chair, and he was. I can't think anybody who actually, zeitgeist is a much abused term, but it means something, the spirit of the age.
Yeah.
If you were a certain sort of person with a certain background, certain ambitions for a certain period between the mid-60s and, I don't know, the mid-80s, 90s of the last century, Terence Conran represented all of that, and he put it all into a wonderfully attractive hold. Said, go to my restaurants, go to my shops, and you can be a little bit like me. He was a gift to the media, and he was, if you like, and he was put it this way, he was a print era influencer.
Yeah. But there's something that
he didn't do it consciously. He couldn't absolutely tell me. Even towards the end of his life, when he'd already made his fortune, had a fine reputation, he would still study the press cuttings every morning. And it was just an affirmation of his existence, really.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that in a mocking way. I'm just trying to describe this extraordinary psychology of the man. He felt he was, I caught this from him as well. I personally feel I'm slightly more real if I see my byline in a magazine or a newspaper.
Yeah. No, but I suppose the thing to me is what you describe could have happened by luck, but clearly he kept doing it. He moves from Neal Street to wherever at Pont de la Tour to the Michelin building.
Terence, no. Obviously, luck. It's like what Arnold Palmer, the golfer, said to me: "The more I practice, the luckier I get."
Yeah.
Obviously, there was luck, but no, Terence did it. He did it through quite extraordinary application. And that's another thing you can take. Before I sound as though I'm turning him to a sage, he's not. He betrayed absolutely everybody. He liked things more than people. There was very little love in the man, apart from himself, whom he absolutely adored. But what you can't take away, his motivation and his continuous wanting to get things done was absolutely extraordinary. Of course, it tailed off later in his life.
Well, and you also, but it
was always the next new thing. It always had to do the next thing.
Yeah, and you explain that brilliantly, I think, in the book.
His attention was like I always think it's like the beam from a lighthouse. When it was on you, it was just it was immensely powerful. But then it soon strayed away. It was on to his next thing. As soon as he had set something up, whether it was a new type of shop or a new type of restaurant, he was on to the next thing.
Yeah,
something to do, without trying to sound over sort of philosophical about it. It was something to do with his fear of mortality. Because it came from a dynamic, wanted to do the next thing. It means he could ignore, the psychological and spiritual horrors of the moment, and just. In Ingvar Kamprad, the man who founded IKEA, once actually said to him, I was there when he said it. Said, "Well, Terence, why don't you just take care of what you've already got instead of just wanting the next thing?"
And I think you explain that brilliantly in the book as well. His sort of, I've created this, I'm moving on. And I suppose one interesting example of that is in reading the book, I had to go back and check, but I was struck by how many of these things even today still exist, and how many of those restaurants were bought out by the management and so on. And yet nobody ever talks about them because you haven't got Terence somehow spinning.
Well, no, absolutely. No, it is, there are all sorts of metaphors waiting to be teased out here. It takes more than 5 minutes to do that. But as I said, there's something very strange, and we can learn from the fact that, no disrespect to a man who, in a way, I suppose I loved. Not in a homoerotic sense, none of that, but I sort of loved the sense that like a teenage crush. You remember when you felt both thrilled and intimidated by someone's presence, all at the same time. It was exciting, but also exciting, but dangerous, but always life enhancing. And he managed to do that. He did that for all his businesses. The whole electricity of any one of his shops or restaurants or studios changed when he was there. And
Yeah.
he had for he had an extraordinary sort of physical presence. Not a big man, but quite sturdy. He intuited that if you move slowly, it suggests gravitas. And also, he would speak very quietly, because if you speak very quiet, when he wasn't raging like a maniac, I mean,
Yeah.
he would
Yeah.
speak very quietly, because if you speak quietly to people, they have to
Yeah.
lean in and listen to you. No, seriously, it's like he knew.
Yeah.
So
It's
he was
brilliant.
not a bookish man at all, but he didn't learn these or study them. Somehow it was absolutely intuitive how to manipulate people and things.
But you've touched on something else that I think makes the book genuinely sensational, and almost only you could have written it, or you and Roger. But by the way, I did also enjoy Roger's input and the sort of business structure that came with that. But to your bit, what I absolutely loved is you appeared to be unashamedly willing to go both to the fact that you clearly did love him in some sense, and you clearly had huge disdain for him on other levels. And I wondered if you could unravel that a little further with us. Is it, or and maybe you've said what there is to be
I think
said.
I think I would, I could talk about it forever. I mean, that's one of the I mean, that's part of why I wrote these books. I mean, the influence of Terence was is with me forever. I mean, in fact, let me put it this way. I'd always I'd admired him from afar when I was, obviously a lot younger than him. But I'd read the magazines and thought, my God, I wanted to be like that. That's this man understands the way of life I want to. And then through a mixture of accident and design, I got to know him. We worked together and did a couple of successful things. But then, and he did this all the time. I had sort of become, and I should be talking to my analyst now, not this. I all sort of became more like Terence than Terence was himself,
Right.
and I actually became, this is for someone as sensitive to PR as Terence was. There was a moment when I was getting more PR than Terence was himself, because I'd actually sort of, in this mysterious way, I'd absorbed my hero's energy and style, and was better able, because I'm slightly more bookish and more articulate than Terence was, although he could be very articulate when necessary. I'd somehow become that
Yeah. Yeah.
more than him. And then, of course, he didn't like that one little bit.
I was going to say, yeah, that's the end
But
of it.
then several of his friends, committed suicide or had tragic early deaths. And to his great credit, we spent a few years not talking to each other. He just called me one day and he said, "All my friends are dying. Let's make it up."
Yeah.
And we went out for lunch at Harvey Nichols' fifth floor.
I remember, which is in the book, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
when at the moments where you fell out, if indeed that did happen, how did you deal with that annoyance slash resentment slash irritation? And how did it end? You just
Well, I
wait
think
for him to get
he's
over
still
himself.
there. Actually, I'm still nurturing it. I mean, it's like, I'm not going to let that go away. It's my favorite,
Okay.
longest term companion.
Okay, but I'm understood. But in the short term, you could end up having to talk again. So how do you overcome that?
I think I admired and liked him enough to overlook his manifest flaws and cruelties. Because, as I said, even though, you know, Terence was also a great bully, but I think I learned, perhaps too late in my relationship with him, I learned that fundamental truth about bullies. If you stand up to bullies, um, you tend to get the better of them. I'm sure we can't say this on to the marketing society, but the first time I said, "Terence, don't be a," was an important moment in our
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah,
no, it wasn't. It was never disdain. It was just sort of. It was sort of just. It was more dismay than disdain that someone could, you know. Terence he took legal action against my wife about a commercial matter. I said, "Terence, how can you do this? He's oh, you don't understand, dear boy." And he went, "And how can you?" I ended up, when I walked out of the original design museum. It was Christmas Eve, a long time ago. I had two very young children at the time and no realistic prospects of gainful employment. And it was
right.
just, and he said, it's great credit. He said, "You must be mad to, you must be mad to walk out. How can you do this? You spent all this time building the design museum. How you can't?" And I wanted to go. I was in some sort of existential funk, but I actually think he was very, very pleased that I wasn't there, because then he could have it all for himself.
But if I read the book correctly, you then quite quickly continued to work with him in his
Oh, we
own.
did. Yes, we all come. It was just like, it was a sine wave, up and down, and we had
Yeah.
we had all sorts of things, and
But I didn't
Maybe
clock.
I'm in, I don't, maybe I'm inconstant. I don't know. I probably am. I think I always felt there was a sufficient. I still do now. There was sufficient to admire in Terence, in the good Terence, than there was to be dismayed about in the bad Terence. Although there was a lot of bad Terence about.
Well, I think I fully sympathize, whichever, because I too, like you, sort of will stand up to people in the moment because I think one should. But life is too short to just hold resentments and carry on. You've just got to get over it and move on. If people are
Yeah,
interested, I think.
yeah. Well, there's a wonderful thing. Wonderful thing I completely wonderful.
Yeah, I
I
love.
think that it's exactly that. I can't remember the Einstein thing, strong weak, but it's, the intelligent thing is to ignore
Yeah, and
these
move
things.
on.
And yeah, and yes, and as back to what I said about Sydney Smith, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Our business is to be happy today,
Yeah, yeah,
and you can probably best try to be happy today. Then
yeah. I love it. I could
resentment
end it.
doesn't get you anywhere.
I love that. I could end it there, but I'm not going to. I'm going to give you two more questions if I may. At times, you paint a picture of Terence sort of being quite loose with the facts, let's put it, or sort of embellishing his story in a way where the detail just happened to be twisted to suit his version of events. And in a sense, that of course reminds me of what they now describe as the post-truth world, where people just say stuff. But was he unique in that, or is he early to that, or has the world always been a bit like that?
I don't know. Terence was a highly intelligent man, but he was no sort of intellectual, so he wouldn't have, couldn't have explained to you what postmodern was or it meant. So he wouldn't have said that. But what Terence did, I think I've got this in there. I think the lawyers let this through in the book. He did have, well, what the psychologists call narcissistic personality disorder,
Yeah.
which has got three very clearly defined aspects. And one is a taste for personal grandiloquence, and the second most significant part of it is a total lack of empathy with other people, and third, a necessity for myth making. And Terence was just absolutely, completely unbelievable with that. I promise you. Early in our relationship, we drove down to a college in the West Country together to give a joint talk about what we were doing. And I absolutely promise, in front of all these credulous students who were just sort of, quite rightly thrilled to have Terence talking to them, he said, this is 1980 something I'm talking about now. He said, I can remember the time I went into a warehouse and found a bolt of this blue cloth, and it was called denim. And I said, in denim, we can make workmen's trousers out of this denim, and it will. And of course, all the students said, "Yeah, amazing." And he really, he was actually claiming to have invented jeans.
And do you think he believed that in the moment?
I think he probably did.
But Stephen, quick, I'm sorry, I know I should be letting you go, but of those characteristics you just described that Terence had, do you think you have any of them?
I think I've got almost all of them, really.
All of them.
Except his knack of making money.
Look, clearly you've learned a lot from Terence, and you've been very generous to him in saying that in the book. I wonder what you, because it's a book about him, not about you. What you didn't really say is what Terence might have learned from you, because as you say, he did have this ability to bring very smart, talented people to the table. What would you say Terence might have learned from you?
I don't think he actually really learned anything. I just was one of many in the area of museums, and whoever thought Terence was going to have a museum. In the area of museums, I facilitated the maneuvers of Terence's ego in the same way as certain chefs around helped him, develop, and his third wife, Caroline Conran, she translated the Michel Gerard and the Trois Gros brothers, and added extraordinary credibility to Terence's reputation as a person knowledgeable about food. So no, I didn't. It wasn't he learned that much from me. There was not much to learn. But I was a facilitator in an area which suited it, which he wanted facilitated.
Yeah, yeah. I suspect you're being slightly modest there, but all right, I'll let it go. So the last question, you explained very brilliantly, I think, in the book how he affected all of our lives in terms of design and the furniture and the object in our houses. And you also do the same then in restaurants. You know, he has that massive success which crumbles and then he starts again in restaurants. I just wondered, and this is, I'm not sure whether we've answered this in the book or not, but if you have, please forgive me. But in a sense, I wondered, because he's also, in a sense, he changed the high street as well. And there was a moment where he practically owned half the high street. And I wondered if, had he, I mean, then that didn't work. But I suppose what would the high street, our houses would clearly be different, restaurants would clearly be different. Would the high street have been different if Terence had never come along, I suppose?
Well, no, somebody else would have done it. As Ed with Terence, there were predecessors to Habitat. Habitat, but he was a sort of synthesizer of genius. He was a great editor. He was an editor, an assimilator, you know, rather than an original creator. And there were lots of precedents to Habitat. I mean, he was particularly inspired by an American shop called Design Research, which is in Boston.
Yeah.
There are a couple of other English shops in in East Anglia, which are also inspirational to him. But as I mentioned before, you know, these didn't really get anywhere. The line between plagiarism and inspiration is a blurred one, and Terence was the one who actually got it done, and his ability to get things done was utterly prodigal. You know, Habitat opened in '64. That's ancient history. But just remember, he was actually, what was he? He was 32. 30s,
yeah,
when that happened, and he'd already made it, or he'd already had a reputation made himself a reputation as a designer of furniture. But no, I think Terence, he represented a very particular age in the history of design and the history of media and the history of commerce. But the high street, of course, completely collapsed since in the past 10 years. And in fact, I was sort of rather whimsically walking around, you know, Chelsea the other day, as I often do, whimsically, thinking that actually there's not really very much evidence of Terence left now.
Yes,
except
or indeed of any of London cool. It's kind of,
well, except that I often think, you know, you look in the estate agents' windows and interiors for properties to rent or to buy, and you actually see in this country, in Britain, which we're all meant to be visually illiterate, you see a higher standard in general of interior design in ordinary British homes than you ever find in France, Italy, or Germany.
yeah.
And in a way, that's probably down to Terence's influence.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to end. I would, and the other thing I think, which you clearly explained so beautifully, is his power of reinvention, isn't it? Because not only is he reinventing design and then restaurant, and himself, and you know, he has that major crash, and he sort of just reinvents himself as this amazing restaurateur. Don't worry about the furniture shops; that's history.
Yeah. Well, that was both his strength and his weakness. As I said, like Conran said, he wouldn't look after what he already got because he was too busy looking after the next thing.
Yeah.
And for a while, it really, really worked. But it was like a sort of, it was like turning your whole life into a Ponzi scheme, really.
Yeah. Oh, Stephen, I honestly could talk to you forever. Thank you so much for doing this second interview with us. It's been an absolute delight having you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you.